Space. It large, big size, double extra XL. Jumbo Fanta on the side. It's NaNoWriMo when this comes out. Now currently, as I'm recording it, it's before NaNoWriMo, so I'm trying to save up on words. Because hopefully, as you're watching this, I am finishing up my new novel. Which, yes, actually, many of the new people probably don't know this, but I'm also a writer. I actually have even a second channel where I, for a long time, quite actively even, uploaded a bunch of short stories that I narrated and had written myself. It's called Who is Betty? I'm just gonna link it in the doobly-doo. It came up in conversation. I mean, why not do it? Something else you might be unfamiliar with is this here series, System Agnostic Classes, where we talk about classic or sometimes not so classic classes of RPG systems in the tabletop space, but, without the talking about specifically one particular system, but just a general interpretation of how they might be viewed. That's the first of the caveats of the series. The other one is leave your historical and cultural preconceptions at the door, which doesn't really apply here because today we're going to be talking about space. The sci-fi classics. I mean, maybe you could have some little conversation down in the comments about how I'm going to use the term astronaut and not the term cosmonaut or taikonaut. Which, of course, if you have played a lot of sci-fi games, probably none of those have actually been the name of a given class. They tend to be a lot more action-oriented, and that's fine if that's what you're into. It's just not what we're going to talk about today. Oh, and of course, at the very end, we'll pull a little bit of a twist on the whole thing. The current definition of what an astronaut is basically someone who has been to space. So space tourists are astronauts by definition, really. Meaning that definition does not serve us here today because, unless the campaign was localized to one planet and everyone had been born on that planet, all of the characters would just be astronauts. Instead, let us think as an astronaut not just as someone who has been to space or even someone who works in space, but someone whose work is about working in space. Living in space and space travel is a vast, complex field of expertise that includes aspect of all of the sciences and engineering and various fields of academia. And even in settings with very sophisticated technology, someone whose job it is to be a professional astronaut should at least have a passing knowledge of all the relevant aspects from those fields. Of course, no one can be expected to know everything about all of that, but one of those situations that sometimes happens in stories is that you will be in space and something will go wrong, and then you will require a lot of knowledge about how space works and be able to implement it in an improvisational way. Unless you really want to be exposed to the cold, hard, unforgiving lethality of the universe. Any astronaut should understand the basics of how a starship moves. They should know how to move in zero-G and what to do in an emergency, especially of the depressurization variety, because breathing is good. They should also know how to check and switch out CO2 scrubbers, because once again, breathing is good. Understand the basic structure of how orbiting bodies function, solar systems, planetary systems, maybe even larger scale structures, whatever is relevant to your setting, and also, very importantly, be able to calm someone down from a panic attack. Now, there is a vast technological abyss, though some people in practical terms might rather call it a spectrum, between something that's pretty hard sci-fi in terms of its technology, like The Expanse, and something that's basically just hyper Clark tech, like Star Trek. Clark tech, by the way, is a term that means technology so advanced it might as well be indistinguishable from magic. Because no matter how advanced your technology is, chances are space is not particularly hospitable to humans. And no matter how much your technology has made your spaceship or space station or whatever you reside in habitable to humans, there is a good to fair chance eventually circumstances may align in a way that, makes that break down. This is why, and I'm pretty sure this didn't actually happen at any point in TNG because it would have really stretched the budget of the show beyond its breaking point, but you can be certain that Captain Picard has some training on how to operate and move about on the microgravity float. From here on out, with the basics covered, you have a lot of room for specialization. It's one thing to point the ship at where you want to go and then hit autopilot. If you want to calculate a fast and efficient route, or traverse the unpredictable eddies of hyperspace, you are going to need a navigator. And if you want to do a difficult manual parking job or fly evasive maneuvers without ripping your bucket in half, you're gonna need a pilot too. It's not difficult to water a plant or put a certain labeled nutrient solution into a labeled tube at the hydroponics system that's mostly automated. But to design and maintain an active ecosystem with some level of resilience that will produce oxygen and food and the happy chemicals that we humans get when we're around plants, that requires quite a lot of knowledge of ecology and botany. The emergency reactor shutoff button is probably kinda big. It's difficult to miss, it's easy to press it, and there's a good to fair chance that if the reactor's turned off, that's also the button that will turn it on. But jury-rigging a shunt that will overcharge the shields against a super powerful attack by an alien spacecraft, or managing a reactor that's edging on going critical, almost about to blow up, because you need that speed right now. You need the extra power to run away from the space patrol. A nuclear engineer is gonna have to do that. And I know that a lot of the hardcore guy fellas really laugh at the concept of Counselor Troy on TNG, because was she a space shrink? Like a mind doctor where all the fucking tough guys are in space? Working in space is kind of stressful even for the hardest of people, and it's a pretty good idea to have someone there who understands emotional management and can mediate between people who are clinically depressed, because that's just what happens when you're flying around for 2 years to get to some place, cramped in tight quarters. If the ISS wasn't literally right there and it was completely doable to seamlessly cool down to the ground, if there was a significant communications lag like a Mars colony, they'd have a shrink there. This goes especially if you're working with people who are not themselves trained astronauts. For instance, you have passengers that you're transporting acting as a sort of flight attendant. They may be a little bit apprehensive about being in space. They just want to get to a different place. Space is in between them and that place. They didn't choose this, and it's really not their dream. Now, the thing is, many of these skills are actually transferable to other areas of life. Treating injuries and troubleshooting computer systems isn't that different from doing those things on a planet. This means that the basic astronautics aspects, and the fluff of having something be an astronaut skill, really lends itself very well to having characters that are specialized at something that's useful outside of a space context. Which is something very important to consider if you're going to be running any sort of space game. No matter what system you use, the distribution of skills that your characters have should be roughly proportional to how useful they're actually going to be. So if they have a lot of space skills, a lot of conflict should probably be happening in space. You really need to ask yourself what kind of a role the spaceship, if your game has one, will play. If it's just a car, a big safe room that serves to bring the party from interesting set piece to interesting set piece, probably not too much focus in the characters should be on the astronautic skills. A hyper-specialized pilot who can shave weeks off travel time but can do little else is just not gonna have a good time when most of the games is just gonna be you being on a planet, and then between sessions you just sort of hand wave them, not really actively, just then you travel to the different place. Doesn't matter how specialized they are in universe, the screen time that they get will just not make them feel particularly useful. The parts of the story where they get to be cool just sort of happen off screen. And depending on how convenient space travel is in your setting, you could absolutely get away with the characters not having a pilot at all, or like having someone who hangs out on the ship, maybe a robot, maybe they do just punch in a destination and the thing just goes there. You could say the characters have like the basic skills to do all of that. Having the general overall astronautics knowledge is not the longest or most difficult part in even modern astronaut training. The long and difficult part is whatever that particular astronaut is specialized in. The reason we're sending our best and brightest to space is because it's expensive and, we can't really afford to send that many people up there, so we might as well send the absolute cream of the crop. And because all the shit that's up there is very expensive as well, we want them to have a little more than just like a passing knowledge of how it works. Xenos. It sounds pejorative. You can say like Xenos. It just sounds bad. Look, I am a big fan of sci-fi settings where there are no aliens, just humans, or aliens exist but they really have no relevance to the story. But let's be serious, aliens are cool. They're different, sometimes less, sometimes more, and if they are intelligent, they will have formed a culture that's at least as deep and complex as our own. Xenologist is an umbrella term for people who specialize in understanding these strange beings, which, if they're the kind of aliens that defy understanding, could be rather difficult. Much like astronautics, this is an unbelievably vast field. In many settings, you have like trained xenologists who have a good understanding of pretty much every aspect of every species that they run into, because that's their job. That is not particularly realistic at all, of course, but it makes sense that it would be run that way. Think of it this way, right? There are so many different kinds of experts to understand the various different facets and aspects of humanity alone. Medical doctors, psychologists, biologists, linguists, historians, cultural analyst, expert scholars, of whom there are a myriad types, much like every one of the other categories listed. If you add to this the context in which humanity came to be, the natural world of Earth, our biosphere, you might as well add all of the life sciences from like biochemists to zoologists. That's one species, and it's the species that we have everything in common with, because they're literally us. And that's the amount of experts that we have on that. Even when it comes to things outside the natural world, we've had, since the dawn of civilization, experts on foreign cultures. Any civilization that interacted with other civilizations had ambassadors, cultural specialists that understood how that culture worked. And they have gotten it wrong so many times. A full xenologist would need to have all of those fields of expertise for every single alien species and every single culture that those alien species have spawned. Which, by the way, different alien ethnicities and like cultures that exist and subcultures, the kind of stuff that we have, concepts that are dreadfully underexplored in sci-fi, even in a sense when it comes to humanity. Like, we do see a sort of global metaculture emerging, but that exists sort of kind of separately but overlappingly with the rest of culture, like a lot of subcultures do. No one is just part of the one culture. And then, of course, you'd also have a million schools of thought, exacerbated because of the alienness of it all. You'd have very, very specific particular experts, like in a lot of science, which doesn't really work all that well when you're trying to have a game where you're showing off a lot of different alien cultures. So whenever the question that needs answering does not specifically pertain to the historical development of music theory on the southern continent of the Asari homeworld, your expert xenologist, who is very highly educated on that particular field, is going to say, how the fuck should I know? And that's not really all that satisfying to play or to have in a story. You might, of course, want to sort of explore one or maybe two particular alien species in one given campaign. You want to go deep on that one species, in which case having one of like a xenologist that knows something about all of the different aspects that makes them up is a lot more realistic than if you're talking about all the alien species that are out there. Still not very realistic, but you know. And if they get shit wrong sometimes, or are played more with an investigative bent where it's more about contextualizing information that they find, that might create a lot of interesting conflict and have them add a lot to the game. You can also split up xenological knowledge and attach it as ancillary fields of expertise to the various things that the characters are already good at. So your doctor understands some about alien biology and your mechanic understands some about alien spaceships. But if you really want to have the universal omni-xeno scholar and you don't want to just handwave it, which for the record I think would be completely fine to do, I do think that if we were to encounter like a lot of alien species, we find out, oh, the galaxy is actually full of various different cultures and civilizations and what have you, you would see the emergence of a sort of class of meta-analyst xenologists who do not specialize in any particular culture, but rather seeing and interpreting, contextualizing the overall patterns that we see in cultural development among different species, because at that point, obviously, we'd have a lot of data, which is the thing that we now lack. And much like evolutionary biologists have noted that eyes have developed like 7 separate times on our ecosystems, it's not 7 probably, but it's a high number. We might see similar commonalities or evolutionary pressures, cultural pressures, mimetic pressures in different cultures that have like a through line, and even see those reflected in ourselves and gain a new understanding of humanity and why we are the way we are. And if you now add easy access to like vast databases full of data about all of those different alien species, such a xenologist scholar might be able to properly contextualize all that and understand what is going on. Because remember, data is not information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not understanding. Be careful though when you introduce that kind of mind augmentation. I'm assuming you're doing this as mind augmentation, as like microchips in the brain, because that's cool. The other player characters are also going to have access to that. It's a very interesting thing to play with, but it will fundamentally alter the way that pretty much all characters relate to the concept of information in ways that we might be seeing in our own world soon. This is devolving into a bit of a futurism episode, isn't it? Yeah, be aware that there'll be ramifications and unforeseen consequences to that. Terraforming is the process of making alien planets fit for human habitation. Or, you know, any area that you want to put any kind of life form in, just with, you know, different whatever that life form needs there. And I can already see a lot of you thinking, Burger, what the fuck are you talking about? A terraformer? I know, of course, what a terraformer is, but why are you making it an RPG class? Well, I recently started playing in a Mage the Ascension Chronicle, and basically the goal of our group was from the very beginning to rebuild New Orleans after it had been destroyed almost entirely by a hurricane. And I found that I had to really adapt my thinking about how the goal setting of a character would function in a place like this, because usually the kind of thing you orient yourself by is a mission where you hunt down a MacGuffin or you destroy, wreck something, achieve a goal, and usually leave a trail of destruction in your wake, because that's just what happens when you get things done. Wrecking shit is a lot easier and a lot more fun than the painstaking, time-consuming, and often frustrating process of making things. I had actually, in a previous campaign of the game Lancer, been playing a terraforming engineer who, it became a little bit of a character trait for him that he was kind of pissed off that he was flying battle mechs all the time, as opposed to doing what he thought he would be doing in this place, instead of doing like questionable ethics Black Ops missions, which was save this isolated colony from ecological collapse. And yet, Terraforming a planet, establishing a foothold for humanity on an alien world, that sounds like an incredibly robust premise for a campaign. Now, in all fairness, it is pretty difficult to play a sort of hard sci-fi campaign, any kind of hard sci-fi campaign, because most people are not in fact nerds who know about some like very specific aspect about an experimental field of natural science. And if those nerds are the type of people that you do have around your table, the game is much more likely to devolve into like a lot of arguing about the feasibility of any particular approach. The bane of RPG groups everywhere. It's also much easier to make the process of like hooking comets out of their orbits and like shooting them at planets to give them ice, water stuff an interesting thing to witness when you have a book or a visually stunning television show. But it is a different thing to realize that someone's calculations were off, and with the amount of comets currently headed this way, which are all going to start burning up in the atmosphere at the same time, it's just a few too many. And if they actually all show up here, the colony is gonna boil. So you have to do a quick impromptu mission with very limited parameters in deep space to veer some of those comets off course, costing a lot of resources and potentially a lot of time on the terraforming timeline. We have a lot of like scientific wiggle room here. It doesn't need to be actually realistically how a planet would be terraformed. We can rely on tropes and make up our own shit. You can look at the needs that a human colony would have, the goals that would be set for terraforming, see how the place you're trying to terraform does not conform to those goals, then ideally have your players think about ways in which that could be changed, and then think about complications that could happen with that so you have interesting adventure hooks. But where does that leave a character with a specific terraforming skill set? Well, in all fairness, given the enormous timescales that terraforming usually takes place in, even in games that handle it somewhat unrealistically, they're sort of limited to a very particular kind of game. Namely one where you have a lot of downtime, maybe even years or decades, maybe even a century, as opposed to having just one long, uninterrupted adventure. Which also very much underexplored type of game format that I can highly recommend. But the in-time, not downtime skills of that particular character should reflect their skill set and projects that they undertake as a terraformer. And honestly, it's not really particularly difficult to see machining skills, biology, wilderness survival, area knowledge type stuff coming in handy during an adventure. Terraforming is, like the previous fields of course, rather vast. But honestly, why stop there? Why even limit ourselves to characters? Why not, instead of doing that, play an organization or a series of organizations? Because especially if you have different factions on the same planet, which if habitable planets are somewhat limited in number, is something that will inevitably occur, and even within one faction, several schools of thought, philosophies will eventually arise, to have to manage the competing interests and various different visions that these factions have for what the world should look like once terraformed. You could each play different organizations for that with different visions. The game Legacy Life Among the Ruins pretty much is perfect for this type of game. Or you could just make such a situation the backdrop for your campaign and give the terraforming expert a bit of a Marshall bend where they spend time sabotaging the efforts of other factions, or of course defend the efforts of their own faction against sabotage from the other ones. That's the whole reason why my Lancer character became a mech pilot in the first place, for instance. And yeah, this section kinda is the place where I advocate for the concept of the like single planet, single area type of campaign. Look, I have absolutely nothing against travel-based campaigns. I think they're great. I just also think there is really something to be said about having your players and your characters become part of a one area, a community, a place that they know, where they know the people that they're invested in, because you can always go deeper in terms of the details and reveal more and more interesting stuff. You can have an exploration element to it. You have not been in every single house in whatever fucking city you live in. Or hell, you could make the community into the character, and over time play various different characters from that community, with players switching from character to character depending on what is convenient for any given mission. Look, this whole series is about breaking the mold. I'm just trying to help you get your brain rolling on how you can do that. Why not play around with formats like that? If that sounds interesting to you, try it. And of course, to immediately contradict myself, let's bring all this back to something that's very much in the mold. To give all these sci-fi things a nice lemony twist, let's put them in a traditional, or perhaps not so traditional, fantasy setting. Many of those already involve space in some capacity, like D&D's Spelljammer. That's a thing where you have fantasy and space. But because that is done in a myriad different ways, your fantasy astronaut could take a myriad different forms. They could be, very classically, a sort of sailor. But instead of traveling on the sea, they have a ship that travels up into the sky on the magical ether squalls and then is in space, where maybe or maybe not there is breathable air. If there isn't, you could always have like a pressurized ship, which is a great opportunity to add some steampunk elements if you're into that kind of thing. But you could also just handwave that and say that the purely wooden hull can withstand those kinds of pressures, which, to be fair, wouldn't be entirely unrealistic. We give wood a lot of shit because we live in this like concrete and steel age, but wood is like tough and resilient. It has a lot of very favorable material qualities, and if you use a couple layers of it, it definitely can do an airtight seal. Or maybe it's still like a living tree and it can heal itself or grow new compartments. Also, a gambeson-based spacesuit or like a plate armor-based spacesuit. It sounds kind of cool. I like that idea. Or you could go fully high magic and have basically like a wizard that casts an air bubble spell around themselves and have like a super powerful flying carpet just zipping through the void. This could be the exclusive purview of powerful archmages, but it could also be much more commonplace with like highly specialized spellcasters with a series of utility spells. And it really doesn't even need to be, strictly speaking, space. These kinds of settings tend to have a lot of like outer planes of where elementals and gods and fairy creatures reside. Those could be space, or the space between them could be space, they could be other planets. If you think about it, Psychopomps, which is the kind of god that takes people from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, they're kinda astronauts in that sense, and they usually go by boat. And now it's gonna be quadruply interesting when you pull that back into sci-fi. Xenologists are an obvious one. You probably already have one in your party. Usually it's gonna be the dwarf who's the expert on being a dwarf because they are a dwarf, but sometimes also someone who isn't a dwarf being an expert at what it means to be a dwarf, which no dwarf will agree with. Of course, different fantasy races are seldom particularly alien to each other. They're more like just different cultures, and we have cultural ambassadors for them, but they could be alien, I mean. Different evolutionary niches, adaptations, and pressures could have genuinely driven them into very, very different modes of experiencing the world, very significant biological differences that are also reflected in the way that they have very little understanding or an ability to relate to each other's way of thinking. Living underground requires a very, very different frame of mind than living on the surface does. And if you have elves that are always aware of the presence of magic and can like see it, perceive it, imagine if you had humans who were just able to hear ultrasound and infrasound and see like ultraviolet and infrared light. Their experience would be vastly expanded. The way they think of the world would be different because they would just see it differently. This isn't super outlandish either. There was a time, not in human history, but like before human history, where Homo sapiens was sharing the earth with other hominids like Neanderthals and Denisovans. In fact, put Neanderthals in your fantasy setting. Or you could just go with regular old space aliens. There's nothing wrong with that. It would be an interesting twist. It's kind of what I do in one of my settings that I've been playing around with, where basically gnomes are the descendants of those space aliens. And finally, the Terraformers. They're just a historical fact. We like to think of terraforming as something that we do to make other planets fit for human habitation, but we've been doing it to our own world for thousands of years. You could make the case that that ability is our evolutionary superpower. And it's often not like on purpose, made with some grand plan in mind to like, oh, I will make this area, we will have a generational project, and it will be habitable for humans. No, it's just people hanging out with our livestock in a place, and that changes it. And sometimes it changes it in ways where we're not even interested in hanging out there. There's plenty of landscapes that we perceive as natural, which have active ecosystems, which wouldn't be there the way they are if it hadn't been for human intervention thousands of years ago. I mean, we do kind of have a habit of, for instance, just building caves. We build caves to live in everywhere. And we're so good at it that we can stack those caves on top of each other and they have plumbing and daylight. Many of our forests have not just been devastated, but on the other hand also actively pruned and maintained with the intention of keeping them healthy. Aboriginal groups in Australia have for a unfathomable amount of time performed controlled burns in certain patches of forest to revitalize them and to make sure that all the gunk that accumulates down there gets burnt out, which also just so happens to be a modern firefighting technique, because we understand that if you don't do that every once in a while and you just focus on preventing all fires at every cost, eventually there's going to be a fire that's going to be absolutely devastating. If you add magic to this, your druid or fire shaman, frost wizard, earthbender, they could be a powerful agent of terraforming change. Imagine just a literal high fantasy colony on a barren or potentially even like super hostile alien world. Domed habitats created with like magical air bubbles and controlled by like a technocratic council of wizards that may or may not be somewhat corrupt. And there's probably a lot of stuff on that world that the gods put there for good reason, far away from all the humans and the power-hungry wizards that they are. Now that is a campaign premise. Even with all the genre blending that exists, there's just so much left unexplored, or underexplored, woefully so. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, wish me luck on Nano. I might at this point already be almost done with the project. Most of the novel is already written as I'm recording this, but I've been stuck for a while. And in that spirit, see you around, cunts.